Okay, good evening. This afternoon, this morning, we talked about Nixon and Jimmy Carter and the Cold War, and we talked about where they were approachment with China and what's called detente. What I want to address tonight is the actual end of the Cold War. And the Cold War is going to end very much a whimper and not a bang. And one of the key reasons for the Cold War ending is going to be the instability of the Soviet Union. Um, the Soviet Union, first of all, was a creature that really was not going to last much past the time it did. Soviet communism was built on a principle that you could hand out more than you were taking in. I like to liken it to a very, very sophisticated Ponzi scheme where money is coming in and money is going out, but more money is going out is coming in. And a system like what was set up in Russia after the revolution of 1917 really just in physical sense, monetarily physical sense, couldn't last. And that is the real reason that the Soviet Union truly fell apart. I'm going to give you a very, very quick story to show you how unstable Russia was under under Soviet communism. Um, uh, the example that I like to use is nail production. Very mundane thing. You're producing nails. Well, Um, imagine running a nail factory with no incentive of profit. Um, you'd have a group of central planners, and they would plan all that was being produced in a given year. And the central planners would come in and they would say, okay, we need to produce X number amount of nails a year. And if you made your quota, then you got incentives. So the emphasis was on quantity of nails rather than the quality. And so you're producing very shoddy, low quality nails so that you could produce more of them in a given amount of time. And the Soviets figured out very quickly that if you're really trying to put production quotas on things without any regard to the quality of the product, then you're going to try to meet the production quota with as shoddy a product as possible. And so what ended up happening in communism was the products being produced were not that good compared to what was being produced in the outside Western world. And so a solution that the Soviets found was to go to weight of nails in the nail factory, going back to that example again. And well, then you're producing these overly heavy nails so that you meet your quota. Um, so there was really no incentive to produce good quality work. And there was also no incentive to be creative. What did you get if you were a super creative person in the Soviet Union? If you were the worker that went an extra mile, what really was the incentive to do anything extra? And because of these fundamental problems, Soviet communism really is not going to last much longer than it actually was. It was on shaky ground in the 1980s anyway. The economy was in very bad shape. A country that's very rich in agricultural land was not able to produce enough food to meet its needs. It was not producing consumer goods of really any note. Their exports consisted of raw materials, which is more like a developing country rather than a first world economy. A first world economy produces finished goods and has a service economy with a tech sector on the side. And third world countries, typically poor countries, produce raw materials. And that's what the Soviet Union was producing. Okay. And their economic structure really was poor. And going into the 1980s, we see a Russia that is not economically sound. Okay. Now, in class, we talked about how in the 1970s, also the United States was going through some problems too. We were going through a period in the 1970s called stagflation, and stagflation means that the value of the dollar was rising. I mean, was dropping, causing prices to go up, and unemployment was going up. So normally those two things don't go together. If unemployment goes up, then the value of money is not going to drop. You're not going to have inflation along with unemployment. Those typical things don't go together. But in the 1970s, we had both of those phenomena going together. And one of the key contributing factors to that was the Arab oil embargo. The Arabs, because of our support for Israel, was embargoing oil. So by 1980, the United States had massive economic problems, and so did the Soviet Union. The problem is that the Soviets are going to continue to do the same things over and over again, and they're not going to really find any solutions to get out of their economic issues. Whereas in the United States, the period that was the 1970s, where we were economically in really bad shape, was only part of a business cycle that eventually the United States would pull itself out of. We go through periods of recession and depression and then recovery, and that's just part of a capitalistic cycle. And so even though it looked like both superpowers were in not the best shape in the world, the United States' economic woes were only a phase of a natural business cycle, whereas the Soviet Union's ills were based on a fundamental structural problem of the economy based on lack of incentives and just really no ability to produce products that could compete in the Western world. I challenge you to look at a Soviet car from the period 1970s, 1980s and compare it to an American car. That says it all. Okay. And out of this mix, you get the election in the United States of Ronald Reagan in 1980. And what makes Reagan so much different than his predecessor, Jimmy Carter, is that Reagan had a personality that really exuded confidence. And Reagan, when he was running for office, there was something that made people vote for him, that made people like him. And it was an issue of confidence. And what Reagan did for the United States in the 1980s is made people believe things were going to get better. I like to compare Ronald Reagan to Franklin Roosevelt. Neither president really had a firm grip on economics. And yes, I'm making that point about Roosevelt. I don't think Roosevelt had a key grip on economics. The New Deal was simply a let's try this method of fixing the Great Depression. And Reagan is kind of in that same boat. He's an actor and a governor from California. He is not a dumb person by any stretch of imagination, but he's also not an economist. But his biggest strength is his ability to communicate and make people believe things are going to get better. And I firmly are of the school that if you believe in your heart things are going to get better, they will. And so what ends up happening in the 1980s is that the United States really takes off economically, for my opinion, two reasons. One is that we believe that things are going to get better. Two, and this is where a lot of people disagree with me, I do believe that Reagan's tax cuts and his deregulation made it easier for businesses to make money. It's referred to as trickle-down economics, but a lot of people believe it did more harm than good. I think it did harm, but I don't think it did more harm than good. I think it really helped with the economic expansion in the 1980s, and there are a lot of people who disagree with me, and that's fine. Now, let's talk about how all of this relates to the Cold War. As the U.S. economy in the 1980s is really doing well, and pulling out of this period of inflation and unemployment of the 1970s, the Soviet economy is simply spiraling more and more out of control. And one thing that Reagan does is he believes that our economic situation would support a massive military buildup, even at the risk of running massive deficits in the economy, meaning you're spending more money than you're actually taking in through taxes. Reagan really believed that our economy could handle that. He also had a belief that the Soviet Union couldn't keep up with a military arms race. Their economy was too weak, and he really believed that. And so, starting in his first term, he started increasing military spending to a level that was unprecedented, really, in peacetime. And he also started to put emphasis on new technologies, such as a space-based anti-ballistic missile system that was called the Strategic Arms Initiative, that was nicknamed Star Wars. And this was a program that the United States was attempting to develop that was supposed to be able to shoot nuclear missiles down that were coming from the Soviet Union to hit the United States. The technology wasn't even close. We struggled to do these, to shoot down missiles coming into our airspace today, much less the 1980s. It was really unworkable technology. But again, Reagan had this ability to project an idea and make people believe it. When he was elected, he made people believe the economy was going to get better and believe things were going to happen to make their lives better, and they did. And then he made people believe that the United States was working on a program that would be able to shoot down Soviet weapons that were incoming to hit the United States. And even though the technology wasn't even close, the Soviets bought it. And so the Soviets really were in a bind. Their economy was in a really dreadful situation, and the United States was in a full-blown military buildup. And as we talked about in two class periods, Nixon had flipped China, or had been the conduit to flip China. And now the Soviet Union was looking at a rearmed, reinvigorated United States military that had fully recovered from its unsuccessful bid to save South Vietnam, on top of facing Western Europe. And the Soviets really began to look at the situation in really a desperate light. Another problem with the Soviet Union at this time was their leadership kept dying. The dictator that followed Khrushchev, Leonid Brezhnev, died in the early 80s, and then he was replaced by another old guy who died, and then another guy, that Konstantin Chernenko, who was dictator for a year, and he died. And so you had massive amounts of turnover in Soviet leadership until a younger man in his 50s, very young by Soviet leadership standards, named Mikhail Gorbachev, comes in and begins the process of rebuilding a relationship with the United States, because the Soviets cannot keep up with us militarily. He knows sinking money into an arms race is going to be money that his economy cannot handle spending, whereas America at this time was going to be able to handle the mass deficits that Reagan was running up. And so what happens with Mikhail Gorbachev is he begins to open the Soviet Union up. He starts a process called glasnost in the Soviet Union, which was an openness. And he allowed freedom to come in. Now, one thing about the Soviet Union that is pretty interesting, it was not a single ethnic group nation. It was a nation of multiple ethnic groups. The biggest ethnic group were Russians, but you had in the north, you had Latvians, Estonians, Lithuanians. You had, working your way down south, you had Moldovians and Ukrainians, and Ukrainians hate Russians. So those two groups do not get along at all. And moving into Asia, you have the Stans, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and a few others. And in Russia itself, Russia proper, you have multiple ethnic groups. Well, once you begin to open up Russia and you begin to allow these different groups to express themselves, one way they express themselves is in the idea that we really don't want to be under Russian domination. And so you begin to see the process of the Soviet Union as a nation state unraveling and the different ethnic groups beginning to split apart. As that is happening, you start a process called perestroika, which is the introduction to free market capitalism into the Soviet Union, which causes massive disruptions, a shock therapy to the Soviet economy, which allows individual initiative and privatization to a communist government-run economy, which then causes mass chaos. As that is happening, groups in Eastern Europe that had been under Soviet domination begin to sense a weakness in Soviet authority, and you begin to have attempts to break away from Soviet domination. And this is led in part in Poland. Throughout the 1980s, the Poles have been very unhappy with Soviet control and the direction of their government. It was led by Polish dock worker, shipbuilder named Lech Walesa, and he started an independent union separate from the government, which was unheard of in a communist country. And momentum built up, and finally, one by one, the different communist governments of Eastern Europe began to break away. And what began to happen in Eastern Europe, in Eastern Germany, which was a Soviet section of Germany, was that groups in Eastern Germany had been rabble-rousing, had been very vocally demanding an opening of barriers between West and East Germany. And the East German economy was basically in the same state as the Soviet economy, and it wasn't good. And eventually, the East German government opens up contact with West Germany. And once that contact is opened up and movement is allowed from east to west, that is going to end up killing the government of East Germany, because nobody is going to want to live in a totalitarian dictatorship with a very hideous secret police when you can move into Western Germany and back and forth. And so you see very clearly the Berlin Wall coming down once you allow movement back and forth. So the Cold War basically ends when the Soviet Union is no longer able to compete on a global sense with the United States because of its struggling economy. Ronald Reagan, a lot of times, is credited with ending the Cold War. And I would disagree a little bit with that. I think that the Soviet economy was in such a bad, dreadful state that it is more of a culprit for the Soviet Union becoming weaker. I think Ronald Reagan does deserve credit for kind of pushing down the rotten house that was the Soviet Union. It was right place, right time. So anyway, to conclude, the Soviet Union will fall apart in the 1990s. The Berlin Wall will fall down shortly thereafter. And Reagan will get the credit for ending the Cold War. And the Cold War again ends with a whimper and not a bang, thank God. No nuclear weapons flew between our two great nations. So anyway, good night. And that is pretty much an end of the Cold War. Thank y'all.